Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your coffee. I hope you've found this morning's presentations as stimulating as I know I have. My name is Kirsten Binyard, and I am delighted to be chairing this panel focusing on understanding the implications for international security and stability. And this is where we're really going to drill down into what does this all mean for us? I mean, it's kind of a selfish question, but in our community of security and arms control practitioners, what does this mean for us? The previous panel offered an initial grasp of the technical side and the capabilities of synthetic media. So over the next 90 minutes or so, we're going to be examining how synthetic media could potentially be used to erode trust in international relations and possibly present novel risks for international peace and security. And in this panel, we're going to set aside some of the potential harms that we did hear about already as examples. Some of those harms at the more individual level, such as revenge porn or the rights of individuals to control the commercial use of their image and identity. I wonder if we'll be hearing from Leonardo DiCaprio's lawyers any time now. Well, it's quite possible. Or even small level, individually targeted, like cybercrime, criminal phishing attacks, those sorts of things. And rather, we're going to drill down to the consequences of synthetic media for international relations. So things like how synthetic media can facilitate the criminal and malicious use of ICTs, a topic that the international community has really been struggling with since the late 1990s, when the technology was far less sophisticated than today. In our international relations, how synthetic media can be used to deceive or influence high-level political talks or negotiations. In times of international crises, how it could be used to influence public opinion, undermine political leaders, or spark violence or social unrest. In times of crisis, fabricated or manipulated media could potentially contribute to escalation and miscalculation. And the consequences really cannot be understated. Essentially, any decision-making process that relies on trustworthiness of information, and whether that's at the highest level between states, between institutions, or between individuals, that contract of trust is potentially vulnerable. Developments in synthetic media can falsely cater to our very human belief that seeing is believing, or I heard it with my own ears. However, in a world of synthetic media, the corollary of seeing and believing is also true. Believing is seeing. Trust in governments and public institutions is at record lows. According to a 2019 study of OECD countries, only 45% of citizens trusted their governments. Compounding this trust deficit in legitimate institutions, around the world we are witnessing the growth of extremist movements, science deniers, and conspiracy theorists seeking to affirm or spread their worldviews. In addition to that, we have malicious actors, whether criminal, states, or individuals, willing to exploit new technologies for financial gain, power, or influence. And lastly, we have populations who are perhaps ill-equipped to consume this media with a critical eye. We've heard several of our previous speakers this morning mention that deepfakes can result in this liar's dividend, where anyone can cast doubt on authentic content simply by claiming that it's false. And together, these factors mean that synthetic media has fertile terrain to flourish. So to help us explore the risks to international security, we're going to look at the relevant actors, the unique challenges, and potential responses. And I'm joined by an all-star group of experts to help us do that. I have a range of really interesting backgrounds and experiences. I'm joined here in Geneva with Alexi Drew, Senior Analyst at RAND Europe. I have Saifuddin Ahmed, Assistant Professor at the Nanyang Technological University of Singapore. I have Moliehi Makumane, researcher in UNIDIR's Security and Technology Program and former South African cyber diplomat. We have Peter Topichkanov, Senior Researcher at CIPRI, Anita Hazenberg, who's a Director at INTERPOL's Innovation Center, and lastly, Valeria Solis, Director of Cybersecurity in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico. If you'd like more information about our panelists, check out their bios in the conference program. And following a few rounds of questions, we'll turn to the questions from the audience. You can, of course, at any time during the presentation, submit your questions on Slido. So we have a lot of ground to cover in the next 90 minutes or so it's time to jump right in. Let's set the scene in building on what we've heard already this morning. Alexi, why don't you kick us off? We've heard a lot about trust. Trust is important. It's vital in the realm of politics and relations. And we've heard about the variety of ways that deepfakes might threaten it. Could you help us focus and drill down on that?
Yeah, I think it's critical that I'm not the first person who's mentioned trust, which actually makes this easier to kind of build upon the precursor that's been done. Trust is, in a way, the currency or the foundation on which most of our relations in this information age is then built. If we talk about the types of communication we engage in, this can be interpersonal between individuals that we already know. It can be in a more communal sense between large groups of individuals that we might have some connection with, be it through ideology, identity, or ethnicity, or any other type. Or it might be on a larger scale about the transmission of critical information about our daily lives. It might be something as trivial as, how do I go from one place to another, or what is the cost of this good or this service in this place or another? All of these things rely on our ability to trust the source of the information that we're going to receive that information that we're looking for. Now, in many of these cases, it's pure data points. A cost of an item is a cost of an item. And that perhaps is something which is easy for us to trust, particularly when we then go and experience that, in fact, that cost is as advertised. But as soon as there's potential for semantic expansion where you can have a layer of disassociation from a pure, simple scientific fact, that's where trust can begin to break down. And that happens normally without the inclusion of synthetic media. We have different ways of trying to build trust with audiences, and trust comes from different sources. It can come from legitimacy through democratic process. It can come through legitimacy through scientific background. It can come through legitimacy through all sorts of different social cues that demonstrate that this person or this source is more trustworthy than another that you might otherwise approach. The problem where synthetic media becomes to come in is, building on this liar's dividend that's repeatedly come up, is that not only can you in fact build trust based on nothing and build trust in a truth that is completely false, you can also make it so we cannot trust things which would otherwise be objectively true. We get the point where media can be produced that undermines the very fabric of trust in all senses, that things which otherwise would simply be taken from a trustworthy source as fact, be it medical, be it accounting, be it your day-to-day interpersonal relationship. So if someone, for a purpose, a personal one, a political one, or an ideological one, can simply point the finger and say, but that could be false. And if they can do that in an understanding of a world where synthetic media is as good as it is becoming, then that is Pandora's box open, and the concept of trust, this foundational thing which we require in this modern digital age, is breaking down. And that, I think, is the underpinning problem that we're developing towards, is that trust is being dissolved, pushed away by an increasing ability to discount any evidence presented to us from any source. And that's something that synthetic media is significantly contributing towards.
Thanks, Alexi. I think that helps kind of, as we say, put the church back in the middle of the village, right? Because trust and issues around trust are not new. That synthetic media didn't, invent this issues about trust deficits. Now, the question is, how do they compound them, and what do we do about it? And interesting, in our community, of course, trust but verify is, a keystone phrase for us. So where do we go with the verification side? I think we're going to have to circle back around to that in the end about responses. So let me pass over to Saifuddin about what makes deepfakes different from or more dangerous than like other forms of disinformation.
Thank you for the question. So, as all of us know, deepfakes are fake, manipulated videos created using deep learning methods. They can typically be used to spread disinformation. So in the last few years, we have seen the impact of fake news on societies worldwide. But with deepfakes, the threat is perhaps a bit more. My data suggests that those who engage with deepfakes on social media become highly skeptical of all kinds of information. This would include even real information, and that's a problem. If citizens begin to doubt even real information, it would put societies at risk because we would fail to establish a basic ground for truth. Now, there are three things that make any disinformation campaign especially dangerous, and deepfakes possesses all three. They're accessibility, verisimilarity, and deniability. So deepfakes are accessible because they're easy to create, even for free and by non-tech users. And thanks to social media apps, they're easy to share with everyone. Now, they are very similar, that is, they appear to be real, to be true or real to reality, but they may not be real. So they fool viewers because of the realism heuristic, which basically means that we as social media or internet users are more likely to trust videos rather than text as a more reliable depiction of the real world. This is further amplified if the disinformation is targeted at our own prejudices. We often fall for our own biases, and if the content is in line with what we want to think, then we don't question the authenticity of such content. So as the behind deepfake progresses, the manipulated reality could be more convincing, amplifying the cost of this form of disinformation. Third, deepfakes facilitate deniability by organizations or states or individuals. And you mentioned this previously, the liar's dividend. So this is because we live in a so-called post-truth environment. So it has become common practice for spokespersons to deny the authenticity of factual content and declare it to be false. So it's easier to deny the evidence and declare it to be manipulated or tampered. So here deepfakes kind of blurs the boundary between what is real and what is fake. But most importantly, deepfakes creates information uncertainty and skepticism in the minds of citizens, affecting their levels of trust. And trust is so important to societies as our laws are built upon social and political trust. So here deepfakes can be used to target and malign certain groups, individuals, or even states. The dangers are that it can not only disrupt social and political affairs of a society, but it can also cloud factual information and infuse information uncertainty among the citizens. So I'd like to reiterate that if citizens begin to doubt even real information, it would put all of us at risk because we would fail to establish common truth. Yeah.
Thanks, Safdin. Let's continue on with that about the risk to the citizens. Alexi, would you agree? Who or what is most at risk with the misuse of this type of technology?
I think it's something that is developing as the technology does. Now, we've already talked about in the last panel how there are those who are already at the most vulnerable in a society are in fact the most vulnerable to this form of technology. The misuse of this to target revenge pornography is one example of that. But I think as we develop, as the capacity and the capability of this technology develops, it's more likely to become attractive to those who are going to use it for more nefarious purposes on a grander scale. One of the previous panelists mentioned, for example, organizations that do influence for hire. There's a significant amount of an industry developing around this, of organizations which essentially are doing what you would normally perhaps call marketing, but it's in fact developing capabilities and capacities in mis and disinformation to carry out political goals for the client. These are the kinds of organizations that are going to see a significant opportunity here. And at that point, it becomes a problem that shifts from the personal, which it doesn't move away, that will still be there. But it becomes one which is potentially far more damaging to the social cohesion of a larger area or region or sub-region, or in fact, I would argue eventually globally, because this is not something that's going to stay contained within one area with limited governance or limited technical capability. It will spread. The question is, are we ready for that? And that, I think, is the question that we're trying to answer, or one of the questions we're trying to answer today.
It's interesting the parallels with other digital technologies and ICTs, which started initially, malicious use of ICTs was very individually focused on individuals. And while, as you rightly say, that harm hasn't gone away and those danger hasn't gone away, the scale of our ICT incidents has gone to international security proportions.
Yeah, and we used to see in the early stages of cybercrime that it was criminal organizations that were using nefarious and malicious means to gain monetary goals. It quickly became a tool of companies and states, and now we see it's pretty much ubiquitous that cyber espionage is a state activity as well as a criminal one. It's pretty clear that this is exactly the same direction of travel that synthetic media is taking.
Right. That seems like a good transition over to Peter. Welcome. What vulnerabilities do synthetic media and deepfake technologies create for strategic stability relations. So let's move from that individual level up to a much grander scale. So what are the vulnerabilities that you see in our international relations and dynamics between states?
Thank you so much. It's a very complicated question, and also it's related to the discussion you had before. Because when we imagine strategic stability relations between nuclear armed states, we imagine a comprehensive system of intelligence, surveillance, early warning, nuclear command, control, and communications, and political and military leaders who base their decisions on robust and confirmed information received from multiple sources. So, but it's an ideal picture. But in fact, I can assume that there are many points of entrance for poisoned information, for deep fakes, for unverified data to this system that I just described. And especially, it's about nuclear armed states involved in adversarial relations, in tensions relations. And there are several conditions when these points of entrance for unverified data and deepfakes can provoke escalations. There are several conditions. And these conditions are deployed nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons and troops, or in forward basis, lack of effectiveness of command control and communications, technical issues related to cybersecurity of these systems, broken line of communications between the countries involved in tensions or adversary relations, and last but not least, tensions relations between adversaries, lack of trust, and escalations dynamics existing between them on political, economic, and military levels. Everything that I just listed, it's about lack of time that the involved sides have to assess what this deepfake could mean, and to confirm this data with other sources. Because if the sites are under pressure, under time pressure, when use or lose, I mean, to respond to this deepfake with alerting nuclear weapons, with more aggressive reactions, postures, statements, and movements of troops, or just to wait and to assess what just happened. So it will be a dilemma for any leadership involved in these tensions relations with nuclear adversaries. Thanks.
Peter, you really focus there on nuclear armed states and let's say maybe more adversarial relationships. But what about, could you say a little bit about what could be the consequences or risks with our allies and adversaries? I mean, our allies and our perhaps like security alliances, where trust amongst trusted partners is also very important. Could you say a few words about that?
Yes, it's true, and it's not only about nuclear armed states, it's about allied non-nuclear weapon states, because if potential deepfakes related to a growing threat of nuclear use against non-nuclear weapon states, of course it can provoke significant changes and decisions, including the decisions to protect themselves with the help of nuclear armed allies, but also with the help of developing their own military, cyber, conventional nuclear capabilities to face this growing threat. So it's about, but also I would say that in ideal world, such cases would provoke also growing debate and discussions between nuclear armed states and non-nuclear weapon states, and they should provoke sharing intelligence data just to assess, because sometimes non-nuclear weapon states don't have early warning and intelligence capabilities to assess potential nuclear threats. From this point of view, for them, it would be important to have effective intelligence sharing with their allies possessing nuclear weapons, but also possessing early warning intelligence surveillance capabilities.
Thanks, Rita. Let's turn maybe to the variety of actors that we have to think about when we're discussing this. Moliehi, these last 2 years, you've been personally involved in both of the international negotiations on ICT's international security, the outcome of which reaffirmed the consensus of all UN member states to adhere to a set of 11 voluntary norms of responsible state behavior. Does synthetic media and deepfake technologies undermine the international framework for responsible state behavior and the use of ICTs?
Hi, Kirsten. Nice to see everyone. That's an interesting question, and I think what's important, for everyone is to look at the framework of responsible state behavior and what the UN member states have agreed to. And one of the things that, for instance, comes out of the 6th GGE report under emerging threats is this idea that the new technologies, though they are expanding the positive opportunities, they're also creating new vulnerabilities that can be exploited. And that is going to become a serious challenge for member states. And so I give a tick for member states for that because we are definitely on the pulse. But what is concerning, for me at least at the current moment, are actually 3 things, and how I think synthetic media is going to undermine the framework. First of all is our conversations around these dual-use technologies, which everyone has been talking about for the majority of this morning. More and more, we're going to be pushed, I think, to a point where the discussions around the balance between the positive benefits of technology and the vulnerabilities to international security are going to become amplified. And who wins on either side comes down to trust again. Can we trust the technology? Can we even trust leaders to use that technology responsibly? And so I think that's going to become one of the questions, which again starts to unravel that international framework of responsible use of ICTs. And the second one that I think is going to also start unraveling that is the nature of the space itself. It is multi-stakeholder, and we've got states, non-state actors, and can we trust each other when it comes to dealing with this issue? And I think it's going to become, the trust unraveling is going to become more and more amplified as states possibly retreat and try to do the implementation of the framework by themselves, because that trust between the state and the non-state actor is going to become a bit more acute. But for me, actually, the most important thing is, I think there is going to also be an unraveling of capabilities and competencies when it comes to responsible use of ICTs. And the framework also notes this, that the discrepancies or the difference in capacities of member states to implement the framework creates vulnerabilities for the system at large. And so you look at something like the norm on attribution. How do all member states reasonably implement that part of the framework when by nature the synthetic media is, as other panelists have said, it's almost impossible to identify one, and the solutions aren't very clear. And the capacities are going to start to become markedly different between member states that can implement the framework with regards to that and member states that can't. But the other thing also has to do with the deepfake disinformation activities, which I think is going to become a big problem going on. The framework identifies disinformation as an emerging threat. But truly in certain countries, it is a threat that is at the door, and in certain countries, it is very real and alive. And how do member states implement that norm then when they are faced with the level and sophistication of disinformation activities being driven by deep fakes as the one that we'll be looking at? How do we reasonably expect a country to sufficiently implement norm 13 on human rights in the digital age, when one of the things that are there is to ensure that the activities are inclusive and accessible and do not negatively impact members of individual communities. So all of this is going to, I think, become more acute. And speaking from my side of the world, it's going to become very problematic to be able to implement the framework. And that's why I think it really undermines it by getting to the core of what member state capabilities and competencies were calculated to be. Not every country is able to identify the capabilities of the synthetic media, either owned by state or non-state actors. Not every country is going to be able to develop a capability to detect and attribute it. Not every country is going to be able to assess intelligence or influence operations being led by this media. And so it's almost as if it shifts the goalposts with regards to what we thought that member state capabilities and competencies would be. And because it's starting to unravel that, we're going to have to act very fast. Thanks, Kirsten.
Thanks, Moliehi, and I'm really glad that you brought this into the context of where the international community, where states are with their existing commitments. Often with new technologies, we see that we seem to focus on the technology and not embed it into the larger conversation of existing agreements and existing understandings between states. And the norm of attribution is a wonderful example of that. And I'm glad that you're making that connection. We can circle back to it in a bit. Valeria, let me bring you in here. Can governments alone deal with this, the potential risks, or is this an issue that really requires a multi-stakeholder response? And if so, which other stakeholders are necessary to help us design and implement effective responses for the international security dimensions of these issues?
Thanks, Kirsten. I would like to first of all build a little bit upon what Moliehi said about the focus maybe that should be probably put on the voluntary norms, and maybe we need to develop more norms regarding, well, focusing specifically on deepfakes, but not only that, also confidence building measures at the international level and both at the regional level. There is a lot of work on that part. But with regards to the multi-stakeholder challenge, also let me tell you that from the governmental perspective, of course, the deepfakes challenge could become a serious threat, not only to national security, but to international security, as has been said by previous panelists, because it definitely breaches trust in a shocking way, in which we can no longer trust our very own human eyes and ears, no? And in the growing live streaming environment that we are living today, even in the governmental sectors, the human relationship to video and multimedia content is really powerful and unique, much more unique than other forms of content like text or images. So this represents definitely an important challenge in the way that even official governmental sources would firstly need to be 2 or 3 times authenticated before trusting their content. not only by other governments or institutions, but by the citizens themselves. And especially if this content is used to target political figures or large corporations or institutions, or is aimed to influence or manipulate individuals' thoughts and actions. So governments can definitely not rely on their own capabilities, either if they already have them or if they need to develop, as Moliehi also previously mentioned. And this simply follows the logic that in parallel with the constant and ever-evolving development of deepfake technology, artificial intelligence is also being developed to counter this threat through machines trained to detect malicious alterations in video. So we need to tackle this challenge through a different and more efficient perspective. And for this, we definitely need to have on board a solid network of multiple actors to create a solid dual system, which ideally should incorporate both prevention and resilience. And so this system could not only authenticate the contents, but could also detect forgeries. And here is where even if all governments at the international level work together, it might simply not be possible to win this new, let's call it artificial intelligence arms race like challenge alone. So with the help and goodwill, and of course the collaboration of multiple stakeholders, first of all, of course it's the industry and the suppliers. We need to work hand in hand with the suppliers in this authentication detection system, probably embedding trustable sources of multimedia content generation through the very first design of the devices. So we also need to have the designers on board, for the production of content through these multiple media formats. For example, it comes to my mind, we need to include camera manufacturers, including the smartphone makers. Everyone has access and has their smartphones and are taking video constantly. But we also need to have on board media content distributors like traditional TV and radio broadcasters, which are also presenting all this content, and also the social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. We need to have them on board. This could be one avenue, but of course, let's keep in mind that responding to the challenge with technical tools alone is and will be insufficient. So we also need to focus on the need to educate the public about deepfakes and minimize incentives for creators of malicious deepfakes, and to minimize incentives for people to just keep forwarding on verified content. So I am pretty confident that a widespread range of stakeholders are willing to work together, because it has been the case also in the international discussions of cybersecurity, to work together to promote effective cybersecurity practices, not for us to achieve an open, secure, stable, resilient, and globally interoperable digital domain. But we have to open the spaces for them, and this we could do from the governmental from the governmental sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria. Anita, how does the advent of synthetic media change law enforcement approaches against crime, particularly maybe international cybercrime or cybercrime that reaches international or transnational dimensions? It was particularly interesting right now with the 2 successful ICT negotiations on international security that we concluded in the first half of this year, and the fact that there'll be a new convention, international convention on cybercrime negotiations starting next year. Could you lead us into some of the connections there?
Yeah, thanks so much, Kirsten. As said earlier, I'm not the director of cybercrime, so I will not touch on the issue of cybercrime too much, but more on innovation. And that is funny, Kirsten, when you introduced this session, you said the relevant words of I saw it and I heard it. And that reminded me of the fact that about 40 years ago, I joined the police in the Netherlands. And fighting crime was based on evidence that what I had seen as an officer or heard from witnesses, offenders, victims, or to other technical evidence, That was what we used. We wrote a report. The report was sent to the public prosecution service, and they sent it to court. And based on this report, hopefully, if we had done our work well, criminals were convicted and put behind bars. Imagine, this is less than 40 years ago, how our world has changed. And I was wondering, listening today to the panelists, like, how will our world look in 40 years? And since 3 years now, I'm the director of a very small team, Innovation Center, INTERPOL Innovation Center in Singapore, serving 194 member countries, trying to help the police in our member countries with the impact of emerging technology. What do we need to do to be ready to be an effective crime fighter now and in the future? And there are two things which for me are very, very relevant if you talk about fake videos in relation to law enforcement in our fight against crime. The first one is credibility of evidence, and the second is the image of policing. The first one is based on the fact, and I would like to share some of our findings, because every week the Innovation Center is organizing a virtual discussion room, mostly about any of these emerging technologies. And of course, we had a session already in November last year on deepfakes. And 180 professionals, 56 countries represented, discussed and gave us a quite good global picture of the present state of affairs. And what I found remarkable, and that's also something I think which was mentioned by some, not everyone believes that it will have that much impact. There are quite different opinions how quick the development will go and how far-reaching it is. But one of the speakers shared that the number of synthetic videos on the internet doubles every 6 months. And voice so far is better developed than video, but still in the law enforcement community, we start to realize that it's just a matter of time. But not everyone is realizing that. So that's something to take into account. But we start to realize that, for example, sextortion attacks will be more and more, using deepfakes. And especially with the increasing number of online services, and one of the speakers mentioned already, it's cheap to get, easy to use. You can just order deepfakes as a service. You pay a fee and the deepfake is delivered in your computer and you just have to send it. So what did we look at? We concluded that there's really a strong need for more awareness and more capacity, more training on all these new developments in the area of audio and video forensic, for example. But especially awareness about amongst police officers about the impact. And it was said before, deepfakes is a kind of arm race. When police finds a method to identify the synthetic media, content creators already have found ways of bypassing the detection mechanism. Many police officers are not really aware of this kind of manipulations, and especially how to re-identify the original source, how to prove the data source. So I cannot underline enough that more awareness raising amongst nations is needed, but also in nations, government have to equip their police services to deal with this issue, because this is linked to credibility of evidence. If policing is not able to present good evidence on deepfakes to criminal prosecution, public prosecution is not able to bring it to court, and we will never be able to get the criminals behind bars, as I just started. Then my second observation, based on that meeting in November, is that a lot of police officers like myself, we are quite worried, because we are trained with the idea that you have to police by consent. And these principles were introduced by Robert Peel, who established the Metropolitan Police in London in 1829. And he was very, very clear that we can only police by the legitimacy, and that if we have sufficient legitimacy and we are sufficient effective by the trust of the people in the communities we serve. Why do I make this introduction? Because I think it's very relevant that if people in public see videos which are manipulated, which are not true, but are showing police in operation where they use a lot of force, where they do things they should not do, this will, create so much unrest in a community. And it's only the police where people can go through in the end. So this social unrest is an issue we really need to be aware of. And again, governments have to equip and make sure that law enforcement is able to deal with these challenges. Back to you, Kirsten.
Thanks. There's a lot there to unpack, and I think this is a really good time for us to turn away maybe from the so what question. I think after this morning, I think we all have a pretty good idea of the, so what, why should we care? So maybe now we should turn to the question of so now what? What kind of potential responses should we be pursuing as the international community? What should we be prioritizing? And what sort of relationships or what sort of communities of practice will need to be brought together. We've heard, I think, quite a bit about private sector and industry developers, but when we look at the variety of trust issues we've discussed, which is trust in the actual technology itself, trust in the developers or the deployers of these technologies, trust in decision makers, and also trust in users. There's going to be horses for courses, right? Where there's not a single regulatory bullet that's going to help here. So let's turn now to some potential responses, and I'll turn over to you, Alexi, first. It seems it's too late to put these developments back in the box. So are we looking at risk mitigation? What can we do here? Are the techniques of reducing exposure or reducing belief that Ahish mentioned in his talk this morning, is that sufficient?
I honestly, I think the problem we have here is one which is actually quite common in what we say. I wrote down a note here that new emerging technologies equal emerging vulnerabilities, and I think that in most of those scenarios we actually find a very similar root cause of a lot of our second and third order problems when it comes to their mitigation, is that the pace and scale is so unlike the policy mitigation strategies that we've had to deploy in the past, that these things occur and develop and change and often then spur new potential completely unique vulnerabilities at a rate and of a type that we've not had to deal with before, and that the policy solutions that we've developed historically to deal with issues in the international security realm have fundamentally been designed to things that develop over 5-10 years. The most common question I get asked over talking with government over any emerging technology issue, be it telecoms or be it quantum, is, well, when is the next thing like this going to happen within 10 years? And my answer is, you're looking at the wrong time scale. You're actually looking, it should be next year or maybe next month. And I think that is really the problem here, is that, to build on the metaphor, Pandora's box is most definitely open. We can't close it. The problem is that the initial thing which is issued forth is in a way varying itself and diversifying into different issues at pace. The problem we face is that we need to be very clear that whatever mitigation strategy we use, be it authentication, verification, or trust building, be it technical or be it media literacy, we need to try, and this is very difficult to do, to try and be aware of what are the second order implications of the actions we take. And that is hard, and we have seen well-meaning attempts at this cause secondary implications that were obviously unintended. There's a recent study I was reading on the plane over here, actually, suggesting that some social media platforms attempt to counter the manipulated content of a certain US former president by labeling it as misinformation, actually saw that same content amplified further on different platforms. Obviously, that was not the intention of that change in policy, and I'm convinced it was well-meaning, and it could have worked. But it should have not been difficult to interpret what would happen next. And the reason it didn't work as intended was because only one platform enacted this particular set of policies. If it had been something that had been done across the range of stakeholders of this form of information dissemination to a public, then perhaps the intended initial consequence or outcome, the mitigation strategy, would have worked. But it didn't. And this is a kind of dynamic that we see repeated again and again. It's because we work in silos. Even within groups and categories of stakeholders, we work in silos. So yes, we need to build up multi-stakeholders, and we look at the fact that we need to build business relation with technology or with government or with third sector and NGOs. But there are still significant business-orientated divisions even within stakeholder groups that must be engaged with, because otherwise we're simply going to keep causing second and third order problems that will happen at greater and greater pace. And that's my somewhat pessimistic and hopefully still helpful answer.
It's interesting when we look at the international community, and particularly discussions that happen at the UN, how difficult it is to bring other stakeholder groups into the conversation. And I think in the ICT field, we've seen in the GGEs and the OEWG, particularly over the last 2 years, we've seen more and more private sector interest in those conversations, understanding the international security dimensions of the business model and where they have roles and responsibilities to play alongside and different than the roles and responsibilities of states. We are still missing quite a bit from the scientific community, the technical community, the technical research community, participating or being invited to discuss how their work might have international security implications. And those seems to be, I would say, probably the biggest missing voice in the multi-stakeholder dimension.
I'd say there are two. I'd say the technical one is certainly the one, but the one that is particularly brought up in this particular synthetic media study is practitioners. And the practitioners now are not just companies, or they are individuals. This is an open source technology. I have used this to test creating deepfakes on my own machine at home, and therefore I am now a practitioner. I am a stakeholder within this problem. So if you don't engage with people like me and those who are using it for other uses, you might create a joined up strategy that solves it for a lot of the market, as it were, but you will miss a huge portion. And that is a dynamic of stakeholders that this sort of forum has never had to deal with before. How do you deal with the individual, not the company, not the business, not the NGO, not the group, the individual who could become potentially a significant stakeholder within this space, the influencer on social media who's learnt how to use Deepfakes 2 or something like that. Those are a group that you need to reach out to.
Interesting. Moliehi, what about regional responses? Are they more dynamic than perhaps an international response or a national response? Do you see a role for our regional organizations or neighboring governments working together on these issues?
Thanks, Kirsten. I see a big role for regional organizations, primarily because I think what we're seeing at the national level is extremes. So what happens, and a couple of panelists before this had mentioned that the technology is most dangerous where content is not regulated. And so at the national level, there are a lot of governments that then use that response, but they tend to go to the extreme side where everything is regulated and the space is significantly shrinking for free speech and other digital rights. And then you also have, I think, on one spectrum, then individual countries that then address the technology itself. So don't want to have development of the technology in certain areas. And, as we've heard, there are positives to this, but a lot of them also tend to go to the extreme end of this. And I think this is where regional organizations consolidating different competencies and capabilities, as well as having a bigger picture, have a big role to play in terms of finding that balance between how do you use everything in that toolkit, the policy, the technology itself, to mitigate the risk. But another thing that we've spoken about, but haven't really delved into, is because it's a technology problem, there's also a tendency to also think that the solution is also going to be technological. And that has financial costs to it, especially for developing or newly digitizing countries. And that cost is something that I think we're not talking enough about as a potential way in which the response can also be geared. So everyone seems to be moving to this extreme end, like I said, of the content regulation. And it shrinks the space for every stakeholder. It shrinks the space for the normal person on the street who we've said needs awareness. It shrinks the space for the industry, even the space for the developers and the guy who is working on this technology. And so the space for conversation is actually shrinking dramatically. And this is where I think regional organizations can really play a pivotal role, also for best practices and exchanging what works and what doesn't work before we go too far towards the extremes.
I'd like to turn to a question that we have that's come in from a participant about setting standards for digital technologies, including for synthetic media and regulating marketplaces. Now, that's not something that the arms control community does. We have colleagues down the road at the WTO. We have the ITU standard setting, et cetera, doing some of those things. But how do we see these components fitting together with our international security policy conversations? Does anybody want to take on that? How do we build some bridges across the silos? Alexi?
I would start with that. I think that it's very clear that there's a connection in an increasingly technocratic world between technical standards and normative standards. And in reality, any division that we believe to be is either it was never there in the first place, or it certainly is becoming less distinct as time goes on. It's great, for example, the previous panel, the representative of Microsoft talking about their standards-based process towards building a means of judging inauthentic and synthetic content. It would certainly be a useful methodology to have an internationally accepted standard of this technology that, for example, includes the means of checking in authenticity and verifiability, and in fact tracking the progress of media from its inception through to its eventual dissemination to an audience. It would be a fantastic thing to do. And the pessimist in me says obviously that you won't get all actors engaging in that. Technical standards, even as they exist today in the most acceptable form, always have outliers, some larger than others, with regards to actual action and use of them. But it would go a long way. But I think that the first step in terms of building these bridges you talk about is a recognition that technical standards, they might be perhaps harder to interpret for those who normally work within a different office from the WTO or the ITU. Those are the same thing as the normative standards today. Technical standards for things like facial recognition or anything like this are fundamentally normative in terms of the human right component and the impact upon individual and national security. We can't treat them as separate anymore. And I think that realization is the first step towards building a credible and hopefully useful and workable and practical standards-based movement forwards towards norms of authentic and mitigation of risk from synthetic materials such as this.
Would another person on the panel like to jump in on this and follow up?
If I may,
Please.
I would add to this that the arms control experience has enough things we can use in this conversation. But I would start with the point that as a technology developing quickly, I would be skeptical that it's possible and even it makes sense to try to control this technology or to try to exploit arms control instruments against this technology. I would rather focus the attempt of based on arms control experience on minimizing or mitigating the risk, and particularly nuclear risks related to deepfakes. So from this point of view, we have a large menu of things already experienced in the past and played quite significant role. To start with, a joint threat assessment. What we have today, it's a valuable conversation in terms of threat assessment. And if the countries or actors, not necessarily state actors, but non-state actors, representative of business, societies, the public media, and so on, if they're all involved in joint threat assessment exercises, at least it will help states and non-state actors to understand what is the danger behind the use of technology. The second step is to accept some common rules, and it's not necessarily about treaties. It may be in the form of code of conduct, rules of engagement, and so on. It may be informal things agreed between state and non-state actors. And the third step would be to agree on concrete measures to prevent negative impacts of deepfakes. These measures may include joint commitments of non-attacking with deepfakes and other cyber means against critical facilities, including military facilities. It's just a brief response. We can, if we want, we can discuss it in more detail. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. We have another question. I want to build on something that Andrei has written here in the comments. Difficult to draw really clear lines about what is disinformation. Information operations are conducted by responsible military actors, legitimate actors. Then where does synthetic media, it can be just another tool in our toolbox for winning hearts and minds, right? I mean, that's something that is a legitimate military objective in a lot of places. So where does having it be legitimate and a tool that we can use as a military operation objective, or a tool within our military operations, all of a sudden become, oh, that's bad, that's manipulation, that goes beyond what a responsible, offensive digital or cyber operation should be? How will we know? Is it just in the eye of the beholder? Stunned silence.
I'll give it a go.
Thank you, Alexi.
I think part of this is recognizing boundaries or setting boundaries, is that it is perfectly accurate. And I think the opening talk of this whole event framed influence operations and the manipulation of media as a long-standing historic precedent. It's not new. And we have also, alongside that, a long-standing precedent of which has developed over time, of when it is acceptable and the boundaries of acceptability. I admit that in my work examining mis and disinformation campaigns and influence operations, I do struggle with the ethical consideration of what I witness used for malicious purpose is also the same tool set that's used for what I would hope would be non-malicious purpose. But I think the boundaries have to be set in advance and they have to be stuck to, and we can extrapolate those boundaries from our pre-existing concepts of international humanitarian law, and we should continue to do that. The second component I might suggest is that it comes down to the very fundamental philosophical component that I hopefully get right, or my first year undergraduate lecturer will hate me forever, is that it's the breaking down of free will. at some point we need to recognize that it is wrong to influence an individual's ability to choose for themselves. And I think synthetic media bears a greater risk of allowing anyone to do that than manipulation of a type that we've seen beforehand. And I think that is a thing that any commander, military or otherwise, should bear in mind, that there is a line that should not be crossed, is that the individual free will of a human being, in whatever context, should not be maliciously altered for malicious purpose. And I think that it's a hard line to battle, but I think all conflict is full of difficult decisions like this, but I would hope that we can keep bearing those in mind, but that's my attempt at a difficult question.
Do any of our other panelists want to jump in on that? Build on that? Okay. I'd like to go back to Valeria and Moliehi. Anita, please. Sorry.
Yeah, no, just a small, I can't underline enough the awareness raising also for, in the case I'm talking for police officers. Police is also, like military, allowed to use force. And it is so important that we together, and that's why I'm quite happy that UNIDIR, another UN agency, together with Interpol at the moment is working for a toolkit. We didn't call it, Peter, what you said, we didn't call it guidelines or code of conduct, because how can you make a code of conduct for 194 member countries? We call it a toolkit for the trustworthy use of artificial intelligence by law enforcement. So again, showing and trying to raise the awareness that the police has to play an important role. We have to be more aware. We have to give them tools in order to deal with not only deepfakes, but the whole spectrum of emerging technologies. Because realize deepfakes is only one issue we discussed today. Eh? There's so many other new technologies having also a major impact. That's what I just wanted to add.
That actually is a great kind of segue into what I wanted to ask Moliehi and Valeria about the discussions that we've had in the GGE and OEWG on ICTs and our national security. In those discussions, there was a lot of focus on these should be tech neutral. Our discussions should be tech neutral. We shouldn't focus on technology because technology changes and evolves in new technologies, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, there are specific cases that have specific risks or risks that are more predominant than others at any one time due to the developments in technology. So kind of keeping in mind the time scale that we've been talking about today and the sorts of speed of developments and the concerns that we've heard this morning, how do we bring in issues like synthetic media to our international security conversations when the majority of states say we need to keep these tech neutral and kind of at a higher level? How do we deal with the actual threats and risks that we've heard about today?
Should I go first?
Please.
Okay. So thanks, Kirsten. I think it's easier for some than others to introduce specific technology issues. But I think with regards to synthetic media, I think we've got the low-hanging fruit of the disinformation part of it, which I think we can peg a lot to with regards to having the kind of discussions that we have in the GGE. And like I think Alexi said, it's at the core of it all, it's boundaries. I think that's what member states are always preoccupied with. There are a lot of practices that do happen, and sometimes the thinner between what is permissible and what is not is a bit thinner. But at the end of the day, there are boundaries and parameters that we must stick to. And even in the discussions of the GGE, we had the voluntary norms, but we also have international law, which I think we should also be careful that an introduction of a new technology should not make us start doubting where we are in terms of what already exists. We can't play fast and loose with international law. And I think member states are, or at least in this part of the discussions where we aren't looking at the technologies like other more expert-based groups would look at, we should be focusing on the parameters. It's not a free for all. You know, there are rules here. It's not a lawless state. And what does exist, we should work hard to make sure that we do set those parameters. There are instances in which synthetic media should not be employed, you know, like in military settings or even in crisis situations, because those can amplify those tensions. We should work towards making sure that those rules are very clear, and then start having those different conversations about what disinformation does when it comes to certain UN conventions as well as articles. And I think that's one way in which we can do it.
All right. Valeria?
Yes, thanks, Kirsten. From my side, what I would say is that this objective or aim to have this tech neutral approach is not only to be careful to not promote one technology over another, but also for the agreements or for the norms to be able to survive any changes in the technological landscape. I mean, we could not even talk about, for example, I'm just saying, start to work on a convention against deepfakes, because by the time we finish it, there will be something else. This has been the case, for example, with cybercrime, but cybercrime is a more general umbrella. And of course, we need to be careful when we start negotiating the convention that we do not insert very specific concepts that could be easily outdated. So that would be, well, at least from our perspective, which I think could be shared not only by other governments, but maybe by other actors, that this neutrality, that would be the aim, to be able to follow the pace of the technology.
Mm-hmm. Saifuddin, what do you see as the greatest challenge to regulation after listening to everyone here when we think about the international security implications? What's the greatest challenge ahead of us?
I think the challenges around regulating deepfakes are to do with volume and velocity of deepfakes. So that is, deepfakes are hard to find in this never-ending stream of user-generated content, and they're highly varied in terms of subject matter and ingenuity. So with regards to regulation, let's consider what governments can do. Given that each country has its own set of laws and guidelines, how should we come up with a framework to handle these challenges? I mean, personally, I do not think that legislation is the only way to handle the challenges associated with deepfakes. Furthermore, perhaps not all the governments are well equipped to regulate deepfakes by themselves. And maybe they should work with private sector, especially social media companies, to regulate deepfakes. Then let's consider what the platforms can do. I mean, how can the platforms identify and remove deepfakes in a timely manner? Or how can they find the actors behind these deepfakes and reprimand them? But even here, there are significant challenges that needs to be addressed. Social media companies have said that they would ban deepfakes and would remove videos if it was detected that they have been edited in certain ways and that weren't obvious to an average user. Now, some have also said that they would add labels to sophisticated deepfake videos and other media if it's edited, and some of them are already doing it. While these are steps in the correct direction, there's still some challenges. First, if you look closely, social media companies agree to removing deepfakes and manipulated content only if it meets certain criteria. Like if the content of the video includes threat to physical safety of groups or individuals, or if it's a threat to mass violence and civil unrest, and so on. But some deepfakes may slide through and not fit the criteria. I mean, for example, researchers have shown recently that it's possible to create falsified satellite images of real places with fake details using AI-driven tech. While to most casual users, this may not be a threat, but this quote-unquote deepfake geography can be a threat to national and international security. So what happens in such cases? And secondly, while it's a good step to add labels and warnings to manipulated videos on social media, we now have evidence, including in my own data, that show that such techniques do not work for all citizens. Some either avoid the labels completely or are not sharp enough to focus on the labels, or they simply go with their own biases and just discredit these labels in evaluating the content of the video, and they choose to just go over the labels itself and not believe in them. So regulating tech is challenging, and there's an ongoing debate on whether social media companies should be held liable for what their users post on the platform. Perhaps equal, if not more, attention should be paid on counter tech that identifies and tags and removes deepfakes from these online platforms in real time. And as I said previously, I think should be a multi-stakeholder approach, and government should probably work with private partners. Thanks.
So then back to the building bridges that we discussed earlier. I would like to throw out a question to, again, all the panelists. We've heard a lot about the importance of education, and hats off to UNIDIR. I think the Innovations Dialogue is a great initiative that allows us to kind of explore some of these issues and what they mean to our community. But education, it sounds very, very vague. And everybody needs to be educated, from our school children and how they interact with social media, to policymakers, to business communities, to scientific community. I mean, everyone needs education and awareness. And so it sounds like a great idea. But again, with the scope and the scale and the speed at which we're talking about, how do we educate? It's just such a big, nice Band-Aid kind of word. What does education actually mean, and what's needed as a priority to raise awareness and educate our different stakeholder groups?
Shall I jump
Please,
in?
Anita, please. And then
No, very clear point from an Interpol police perspective. We have said we focus on the leaders, the present police leaders, who have one important role, is preparing their police organization for the future. We have started to organize tech gym for them. Gym, move, but be prepared, because some of them have no idea what artificial intelligence is. But they are at the moment preparing their organization for the future. We start with the leaders, the present leaders, and the young generation, but they know.
Okay, so we have a cascade effect, get the leaders on board, and then have that influence within their own organizations. Alexi?
See, I'm going to go in the complete opposite direction with this one. I think that we need to start with, in terms of influence and trust, which is why I kind of started this whole conversation on, the group whose trust is most important for international security going forward is not, in my opinion, necessarily heads of state or even heads of institutions. It's the populace as a whole. It's the population that needs to be educated. And the problem is that this is an unpopular mitigation strategy because it is not a panacea. It is not a one-hit short fix. This is a medium to long-term solution. And there are multiple ways that I think this can be translated onto the stakeholder groups that we've talked about earlier. And I can talk about this, I think, as a recently lapsed academic who's just changed roles and left an academic institution. But those of my former colleagues who are doing the most advanced work in technical terms and in policy terms in this space are unfortunately quite poor at translating that research into a format and a means that world leaders, yes, but also the general public can understand. And its accessibility. Most of the information about this technology is not accessible to the general public, even in its most basic terms. We've already seen in other presenters saying that information in a modern sense is generally translated through videos in short, easily understandable, often infographically driven presentations. If we can't translate academia and the cutting edge research we do into that kind of format, we are not going to build trust or awareness in these issues. And there are countries that have actually been proactively doing this kind of thing for quite some time. Just before lockdown, my last trip abroad was at NATO Strategic Communications Centre of Excellence conference in Latvia. And there was a fantastic presentation from, I believe, I might be wrong on this, but there was certainly Baltic or Nordic states, school children who presented on how they had been taught to engage with media in a critical manner, in modern media, that they had been told to actually start by trying to create a false information campaign and convince their peers. And through doing so had learnt the methodologies and means in which they are exposed to manipulation in their modern media world. We need to do that, not just in the Baltic and Nordic and Scandinavian states, but everywhere, and not just for school children. Because we've seen in plenty of research that has been produced in the last 5 and 10 years and more recently, that it's a cross-population demographic issue. And we can't afford to simply reach one generation and miss another, because that simply creates more potential divides for this form of synthetic or manipulative media to create greater schism. So I think, unfortunately, completely directly opposite to the previous commenter, we need to start at the bottom and we need to work our way up. And it's a big task, it's a long-term task, but I think that's where we need to begin.
Well, hopefully those aren't mutually exclusive things to be done. Okay, we're going to have to bring this to a close, but I see everyone wants to jump in on this. So, Valeria?
Yes, thank you. Just a very brief comment complementing both of the responses of the previous panelists, although they are slightly different. This education and capacity building needs to be done at all levels. It needs to have inclusion, not only with regards to gender, but with regards to age and language. And by age, I mean also the older generations, our parents, no? But also our kids that are born already with devices. For this also, of course, governments can do a lot at the national level, but we need to rely also on civil society organizations or other multiple stakeholder organizations which do fantastic work, for example, the GFC and many others. And of course, we need to work together at the regional level with regional organizations. A lot of capacity building is done through that, also in collaboration with these organizations. So of course, yeah, that would complement not only the education, the curricula in governmental institutions for all types of education, but like a massive capacity building efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria. Safieddine, you said you wanted to
Yeah.
have a word?
Yeah. Just building on what previous panelists have mentioned, that you need to focus on the populace, right? So the entire population across age groups. But what I see mostly is when digital literacy programs are targeted, they are targeted to a more vulnerable section of the population. With fake news, it's the older population, for example. But within my research, I have found that even those who have higher digital literacy skills, they are vulnerable to deepfakes if the deepfakes are targeted at their own biases and prejudices. So even if you have high skills, it doesn't mean that you can apply the same set of skills to deepfakes. Because if a particular deepfake is targeted at what your own biases are, then we are vulnerable. So that's, probably then we need a different kind of approach in terms of, and then focus on everyone in the population and not just those who are low on the digital literacy skills.
And do you see governments and prioritizing this?
Probably not.
Is there anywhere in the world that you see good practice emerging on raising critical content consumers?
So, as I said previously, that it's within the interest of governments to work with social media platforms, or where, they are, as it is, they are in better control of the content and the actors itself. So any intervention intervention program should be launched through something which is social media platform that reaches a wider scale of audiences. That may work, or at least train the users.
Okay. Peter, you're the only one who didn't get a final word on this. Would you like to say something on education and awareness?
Yes, please. Thank you so much. I agree with what was mentioned before me, and one of the biggest problems is about silos that specialists and decision makers exist in this area as many other areas related to cybersecurity and security in general. So from this point of view, it's not only about having such an educational attempt to be inclusive and diverse in terms of gender, age, institutional background, regional background, languages, and so on. But it's also about prioritize this dialogue over political tensions and disagreements, because sometimes, and there are many examples, when the countries are involved in political tensions and disagreements, they can abrupt all the communications between them, all the dialogues between them. So from this point of view, I believe and I support the idea that such things as joint threat assessment and educational things in this area to confront deepfake threat, it's important to prioritize over political tensions and disagreements. Thank you.
Well, I'm really afraid that there's clearly much more to be said on this, but unfortunately we've run out of time. I think some of the themes that you have put on the table during this session are going to be discussed later on this afternoon when we're discussing counter deepfake technologies, governance issues and responses, drill down more into that. So with that, I would like to thank our experts, all of you, for participating in this roundtable and for the great questions that have come in from the audience, some of which, again, will be addressed this afternoon. And we now have a lunch break, and we will resume at 2 o'clock with our panel on countering deepfake technologies. Bon appetit.